I'm sorry, I've just arrived. I was at a discussion on aviation, not unrelated to this issue. But if you've already answered these questions, I apologise. But could you elaborate for us what you mean by climate neutral? It appears more progressive on one level than carbon neutral, and seems to encompass all greenhouse gases, but it relies heavily on offsets, market mechanisms and, worryingly, looking to future technical solutions as opposed to accepting the urgent task to reduce the level of emissions. We don't want to have to use clever accountancy tricks. As Kevin Anderson has recently said, we can fool ourselves about emissions, but we can't fool physics and we can't fool nature. They'll find a way into the atmosphere. So my concern with this EU Green Deal is similar to the current climate bill that's gone through the Dáil, because there's a lot of obfuscation and it won't save the planet. My specific question to you is, can you explain what you mean by carbon neutral or climate neutral, and can you also tell me if you've read the recent article in the Nature magazine, which is really raising some alarming issues, essentially pointing out that the deal is based largely on the EU offshoring its emission by trade. So we move away from damaging practice in terms of climate and greenhouse gases, but then enter massive trade deals with countries who block such initiatives and get them to grow the things that we need to offset our climate damaging and unsustainable ways. And to quote from the article very briefly, importing millions of tonnes of crops and meat each year undercuts farming standards and destroys tropical forests. The EU depends heavily on agricultural imports. Only China imports more. Last year, the region bought in 1/5 of the crops and 3/5 of the meat and dairy products consumed within its borders. This enables Europeans to farm less intensively, but the imports come from countries with environmental laws that are less strict than those in Europe. And in the past 18 months, the EU has signed deals, some pending ratification, covering nearly half of its crop imports. And with countries like the US, Indonesia, Malaysia, South American trade bloc comprising Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay and Uruguay. These are not sustainable, and many use pesticides, herbicides and genetically modified organisms that are strictly limited or forbidden in the European Union. Could you comment on both of those things for me, please?
Thanks, Deputy. In terms of climate neutral, the UNFCCC has recognised or said that we need to get CO2 emissions to net zero by 2050, and that emissions of non-CO2 gases need to be brought to net zero in the years following 2050. What the EU and what is meant by neutral is that where you have continuing emissions of a greenhouse gas, that they're offset by the creation of sinks or other technologies that balance them out. The EU, in terms of climate leadership, is going a bit beyond the UNFCCC and saying not just CO2, but all greenhouse gases need to be brought to net zero by 2050. So that's the position with regard to the EU 2050 target. You raised the issue of our climate bill, and our climate bill is seeking to have a similar objective to that at EU level. In terms of the article in the Nature magazine, I'm afraid I haven't read it, and so I'm not familiar with some of the arguments or the evidence in it to support those arguments, but I would certainly be interested in reading it. But in terms of carbon leakage, the EU is certainly very cognizant of it, and in terms of its proposals is seeking to prevent carbon leakage, and in terms of the designing of the new architecture, that certainly will be one of the features to be protected against, and to ensure that we aren't solving one problem and creating another by offshoring greenhouse gases.
Yeah, could you just clarify for me? I mean, the basic contention of the article is that although we move away in the European Union from damage in practice, we're entering into massive trade deals with countries who continue to implement them. And just that basic premise, the idea is that we get food and produce imported into the European Union without damaging our CO2 or carbon emissions or climate damage generally. But we are doing deals, massive deals, with other countries who ignore these rules and actually relying on them. And when you look at the list of them, I read it out, they are generally speaking countries which will be impacted more by the manifestation of climate change, floods, droughts, fires, etc., than the European Union will. And do you not think that's entirely hypocritical and runs counter to what we're trying to achieve by engaging in this whole process in the first instance?
Deputy, it's difficult for me to comment on an article that I haven't read, but...
I just want you to comment on what I've just said.
I think, in terms of parties to the Paris Agreement, I think the key thing is that in the round, the parties to the Paris Agreement comply with the obligations that are on them in terms of reducing their emissions and increasing their resilience, and that the EU brings forward ambitious proposals that put it in a leadership role. And as part of that, the EU certainly is cognizant of protecting against the types of impacts that you're suggesting. And that is the right and correct thing for the EU to do. But in terms of the detail that you have, so in principle, it is right to prevent and work against carbon leakage and to ensure that you're avoiding creating a problem somewhere else by reducing your own emissions. But the specifics of the article, I'm just not familiar with them, so it's difficult for me to comment on them.
Would it be too much to ask a busy man like yourself to read it and to give us your comments in writing, if possible?
It wouldn't, no.
Good, thank you.